Lizzie's text about a late-night contract was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I replied, "Good luck closing the deal with Harry," and watched her world implode in real time. 20 minutes later, the frantic, rhythmic rattle of her keys against the lock told me everything I needed to know. She sobbed about mistakes, but I stood my ground with a cold, predatory clarity. Cheating 7 times isn't a mistake, Lizzie. It's a choice. And every time you lied, you chose him over us. My name is Shark Blackwood, and I was done being the silent observer. I buried that hollow confrontation beneath a mask of corporate ice and turned my eyes back to the empire that was currently trying to devour me. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blackwood Maritime Tower usually offered a sense of limitless power, but today, the Chicago skyline looked like a cage of glass and steel. I sat at the mahogany desk, my fingers tracing the edge of the $500 million maritime merger file I had spent 6 months perfecting. Every decimal point, every regulatory clause, every contingency plan was a testament to my dedication. I wasn't just an analyst, I was the architect of this family's future. Yet, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the city in shades of bruised purple, I felt like a ghost haunting my own achievements. Have you ever stood in a room you built, only to realize you're the only one not invited to sit at the table? The heavy oak doors swung open, and the silence was punctured by the rhythmic, arrogant click of expensive loafers. My eldest brother, Oswald, strolled in, flanked by board members who smelled of scotch and old money. He didn't look at me. He looked through me. He gestured vaguely toward my desk as if I were a piece of office furniture. "The assistant has the paperwork ready," he said, his voice dripping with a condescension that felt like a physical weight. "You can leave the files on the credenza, Shark. We'll take it from here." One of the board members chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that echoed in the vast office. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply stood up, the movement fluid and practiced. I remembered what my father used to say about leadership. The loudest man in the room is often the weakest, but the one who listens owns the world. Oswald leaned in close, his breath smelling of peppermint and ambition. "You look tired, little brother," he whispered, loud enough for the others to hear. "You lack the Blackwood blood for real war. Go home. Let the men handle the heavy lifting." I maintained my silence, a stoic shield against his petty barbs. Kindness is not a weakness. It is a choice made by those strong enough to carry the weight of others' cruelty without breaking. Before I turned to leave, I noticed a slight tremor in Oswald's hand as he reached for the merger summary. He was about to overlook a crucial signature line, a legal blunder that would have delayed the merger by weeks. Without a word, I reached out and slid a small, handwritten memo across the desk, highlighting the oversight. I didn't wait for a thank you. I didn't need his praise to know my value. I walked toward the elevator, leaving them to feast on the work I had provided, realizing that my loyalty to this family was a gift they had long ago ceased to deserve. It's funny how we spend our lives seeking approval from people who are too busy looking down to ever see us. I reached my private office, a smaller, quieter sanctuary on the floor below. The air was still, the only sound the distant hum of the city. Then, at exactly 4:47 p.m., the silence was shattered. My phone buzzed on the glass tabletop, a harsh, vibrating rhythm that felt like a warning. I picked it up. A text from Lizzie. "I have a contract to sign with a partner, so I'll be home late. Don't wait for me." I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The wording was almost identical to the maritime project I had just handed over to Oswald, but I knew the schedule. There were no partners. There were no late-night signings. The betrayal didn't hit me like a wave. It arrived like a cold, steady tide. Trust is a fragile thing. It takes years to build a bridge, but only a few seconds to burn it down. I thought of our 8 years together, the shared dinners, the promises made in the quiet of the night. I realized then that she wasn't just avoiding me, she was erasing me. I sat back, the leather of the chair creaking under my weight. I felt a profound, quiet clarity. Viktor Frankl once wrote that he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. My why was standing in the shadows, waiting for the light of truth. My thumbs moved across the screen with surgical precision. I didn't type a plea or a question. I typed a revelation. "Good luck closing the deal with Gideon." I hit send and watched the three dots appear, then vanish, then reappear. The name Gideon was a jagged rock in her smooth stream of lies. For the first time in years, I wasn't the oblivious husband or the ignored youngest son. I was Shark, and I was no longer interested in playing the victim. If someone always has an excuse not to be with you, eventually, you have to stop looking for reasons to stay. I stood up, my silhouette casting a long, predatory shadow over the boardroom table. I began to pack my personal belongings, each item handled with deliberate, focused intent. I walked through the darkened corridors of the tower, passing the portraits of the Blackwood men who came before me. They looked stern, commanding, and utterly hollow. I realized that my silence wasn't a sign of submission. It was the quiet before the storm. I headed toward my private server room, the heartbeat of my digital life, and initiated a level 1 trace. Within seconds, the first breadcrumbs of Lizzie's digital betrayal appeared, sensitive maritime codes being accessed from an unauthorized remote location. I looked at my reflection in the polished black marble of the elevator lobby. The man looking back wasn't the assistant Oswald mocked, or the husband Lizzie thought she could manipulate. They called me the youngest and the weakest because I didn't bark. They forgot that, in the deep, it's the quietest hunter that bites the hardest. I had been patient, I had been kind, and I had been loyal. But loyalty to a betrayer is a betrayal of oneself. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming, but the heart often hears what it wants until the truth becomes too loud to ignore. I grabbed my coat, the heavy wool a comfort against the cooling evening air. I knew exactly how long it took to drive from the tower to our penthouse. I had exactly 20 minutes before the charade reached its climax. As I stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut like a guillotine, I didn't feel fear. I felt free. The bridge was already on fire, and I was the one holding the match. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but for the first time in my life, I was the one steering the ship. The drive back to North Michigan Avenue felt like navigating through a dream that had turned into a slow-motion wreck. Chicago's winter air bit through the vents, but the cold inside me was deeper, a hollow ache that settled behind my ribs. I had been the shark of the maritime merger all afternoon, but as I stepped out of the elevator into the dim hallway of our penthouse, I was just a man coming home to a wreckage. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to see the expensive furniture or the art we had collected together to know that the air in this home was poisoned. Looking back now, I realized that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves to keep the peace. I settled into the deep shadows of my armchair, my back to the entrance, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. The silence was absolute until the metallic scratching began. A key fumbled against the lock, slipping and clinking against the brass plate once, twice, 3 times. It was the sound of a rhythmic failure. Finally, the door creaked open, and the scent of cold wind and a perfume that wasn't hers drifted into the room. Lizzie stumbled into the foyer, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. She had made it from her meeting to our front door in exactly 20 minutes. She didn't see me at first, and in the faint blue twilight of the city lights, her face was a mask of ashen terror. As she reached into her bag, her fingers betrayed her, and her heavy brass keychain slipped, hitting the marble floor with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the still air. I remained motionless, a predator in my own living room. Truth is, like the sun, Lizzie, you can shut it out for a time, but it ain't going away. I cleared my throat, the sound low and gravelly, and watched her entire body convulse in a violent startle. "You're home early," I said, my voice a calm, terrifying contrast to her frantic energy. "How was the contract signing? Did you and Gideon find everything in order?" She froze, her hand gripping the door frame so hard her knuckles turned white. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. I thought about my father's advice on integrity, that a man's word is his only true currency, and once you devalue it, you're bankrupt. I felt a pang of sorrow for the woman she used to be, a heavy, mourning kindness that felt like lead in my chest. Lizzie began to move toward me, her eyes darting around the room, as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "Shark, honey, you startled me," she stammered, her voice reaching for a pitch of forced affection. It was just a quick meeting. Gideon Harry was just representing the junior partners." She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to touch my shoulder, a performance of intimacy that made my skin crawl. I shifted slightly, a graceful, non-violent rejection that left her hand hanging in the empty air. The weeping began almost instantly, a practiced flood of tears designed to drown the conversation before it could begin. It was just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to. I was so confused, she sobbed, sinking to her knees beside the chair. She used the oldest defense in the book, the fallacy of the mistake. I looked down at her, not with rage, but with the cold, clinical distance of a man who had seen too many fraudulent balance sheets. Cheating 7 times isn't a mistake, Lizzie. It's a series of deliberate choices. I leaned forward, my face inches from hers. A mistake is forgetting where you parked the car. An affair is an architecture of lies you built brick by brick, day by day, for months. I pulled a small, leather-bound log from my pocket, the record of the previous 6 times I had chosen to give her the benefit of the doubt. I showed her the dates, the times, the discrepancies. I hadn't stayed out of weakness. I stayed because I believed in the sanctity of a promise. But a promise is only as strong as the people who make it, and she had turned mine into a weapon. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering lights of the loop. The city was moving, breathing, indifferent to the death of my marital illusion. I pulled a single notarized document from my desk, a legal separation of assets. This wasn't a divorce decree yet, but a tactical fortress protecting my intellectual property and Project Poseidon from the merger Oswald was trying to steal. In that moment, I realized I hadn't just been a husband. I had been a target for corporate espionage. I know about the codes, Lizzie, I said, my voice steady as I turned to face her. I know you weren't just giving Gideon your time. You were acting as a conduit for my brother. I explained the Illinois laws regarding marital property and how her choices had already triggered specific clauses in our prenuptial agreement regarding the dissipation of assets. Under the law, her use of our shared accounts to fund her secret life with my rival was more than a betrayal. It was a financial crime. I wasn't yelling. I was simply stating the weather of our new reality. She looked at me then, the mask of the victim slipping to reveal a stranger I didn't recognize. The silence in the room was heavier than any argument we had ever had. I realized then that I was no longer fighting for a marriage. I was fighting for my own survival. Looking back, I should have seen that she wasn't just a partner, but a competitor who had been studying my weaknesses for years. I had been playing a game of chess while she was playing a game of war. I'm not being harsh, Lizzie, I said, looking at her one last time before heading toward the guest wing. I'm being honest. And for someone who has lived in the shadows for so long, I know the light must feel like it's burning you. I left her there, kneeling on the cold marble, surrounded by the silver pile of her own broken trust. I went into the hallway and closed the door, the click of the latch sounding like the end of an era. I pulled out my phone, the screen glowing in the dark hallway. There was one thing she had forgotten in her panic, a detail so small she had overlooked it for months. I opened the encrypted app linked to the GPS tracker inside our daughter Maya's safety watch. If Lizzie had been with Gideon for 3 hours, and she had been home in 20 minutes, I needed to know where my daughter was at that very second. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. The glowing screen of my phone felt like a heated iron against my palm. In the suffocating quiet of the hallway, the digital pulse of the GPS tracker showed Maya's location, not at the school, not at home, but at a private, high-end lounge in the Gold Coast. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that contradicted my outward stillness. I had endured Oswald's mockery and Lizzie's infidelities, but this was different. This was my daughter. I stepped into the guest wing, the shadows stretching like long, dark fingers across the hardwood floor. Sometimes the person who saves you is the very reason you can't afford to break. I pushed open the door to Maya's bedroom, the scent of lavender and baby powder momentarily softening the jagged edges of my resolve. She lay there, a small, peaceful island in a sea of stuffed animals. I moved toward her bedside, my hand trembling slightly as I tucked the quilt around her shoulders. Corporate rivals called me cold, but they never saw me here. I watched her sleep, reflecting on the sacred beauty of a child's trust. Being a father isn't about giving what you have. It's about protecting what they are. I remembered my own father's voice, a steady anchor in my memory. The world will try to harden you, son. Don't let it harden your heart toward those who need your light. As I adjusted her pillow, my eyes caught the glint of the safety watch on her bedside table. I had personally encrypted this device, a silent guardian for my only hope. A tiny, sapphire blue light was flashing. A voice memo had been triggered by high decibel noise earlier that afternoon. In a house built of lies, children are the only truth tellers. I hesitated, a part of me desperately wanting to preserve the last shred of my marital illusion. But the risk analyst in me, the part they nicknamed Shark, knew that ignorance is a luxury I could no longer afford. I didn't realize it then, but that small blue light was about to burn down my world. I retreated to my private study, the room dimming as the smart lights adjusted to my presence. I activated the playback, the grainy audio filling the space with a spectral chill. The voices were unmistakable, Lizzie and Gideon. The sound of Gideon's arrogant, booming laugh made my jaw tighten. Then came Lizzie's voice, soft and manipulative. "Don't tell Daddy about Uncle Gideon, Maya," she whispered. "Maybe one day, you'll call him Daddy instead." The words were a physical blow, a betrayal so profound it felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. Then, the smallest sound broke me. Maya's voice, tiny and filled with a confusion that no 5-year-old should possess. "But why, Mommy? Daddy is my hero." The audio ended with the muffled sound of a child starting to cry. My wife wasn't just replacing me. She was attempting to rewrite my daughter's soul. Loyalty to a betrayer is a betrayal of the innocent. I realized that my patience had been a form of negligence, allowing a predator into the only sanctuary I had left. I didn't feel rage. I felt a cold, absolute duty to excise the cancer. I sat in the silence of the study long after the recording ended. I didn't smash the glass on my desk or scream into the night. Instead, I moved the cursor over a folder labeled Reconciliation Drafts, months of hope, therapy notes, and shared goals. I hit delete. In that singular click, the husband died, and the guardian was born. Have you ever realized that the person you were protecting was the one holding the knife? It's a lonely realization, but it's where true strength begins. Under Illinois law, what I had just heard was a textbook case of parental alienation. Bringing a child around a paramour during a clandestine affair and coaching them to lie is a heavy stone on the scales of justice. I securely uploaded the file to a cloud server managed by my private attorney, ensuring the chain of custody was unbreakable. I looked at a faded photo of my parents on the bookshelf. Honoring them didn't mean allowing my siblings to devour me. It meant being the man they raised, a man who stands for the truth. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. I walked back to the living room where Lizzie was pretending to sleep on the sofa, her breathing too rhythmic to be real. I didn't wake her. I didn't demand an explanation she wasn't capable of giving. I stood over her for a moment, the woman I had once loved, now a complete stranger. I whispered to the shadows, my voice a ghost of a promise. "You didn't just choose him over me, Lizzie. You chose him over her, and that is a debt you can never repay." She didn't stir, but I knew the clock was already ticking for her. I returned to my desk and opened my laptop, the light reflecting off my glasses. I began a search that had nothing to do with divorce or custody. I typed 3 names into my private database: Oswald Blackwood plus Gideon plus offshore maritime licensing. I needed to see the bridge they were building together, the one they expected me to pay for. My knuckles whitened as I realized the scale of the theft they had planned. Looking back now, I should have seen that their greed knew no borders. The small blue light on the safety watch in the next room finally flickered out, leaving me in a darkness more profound than any Chicago night. My daughter's hero had to become my family's nightmare, and I was ready to play the part. I didn't know what the morning would bring, but I knew I wouldn't be meeting it as a victim. That's where it all started, the moment I stopped trying to save the house and started deciding who got to keep the keys. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but the shark was finally in the water. The fluorescent lights of the Blackwood Maritime Tower hummed with a synthetic energy that matched the cold calculation in my veins. Friday mornings used to mean something different: a shared breakfast, a hurried kiss, and the quiet comfort of a routine I thought was built on rock. Now, standing by the sleek Italian coffee machine, I watched Oswald hold court with 3 junior board members. He was laughing, that broad, theatrical sound that projected a confidence he hadn't earned. I checked my watch. It was exactly 8:10 a.m. In the world Lizzie had constructed, she was currently at Maya's school, volunteering for an extra shift that didn't exist. Have you ever looked at someone you've known your whole life and realized you were staring at a stranger? Oswald spotted me and broke away from his circle, crossing the polished floor with a stride that screamed ownership. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture meant to diminish me under the guise of brotherhood. There he is, the hardest working man in the building, he boomed, his eyes scanning me for any sign of the shark I had become. You look focused, Shark. A bit intense, but focused. Keep being a good soldier and staying out of the big league, and we'll make sure you're taken care of. I looked at him and forced a thin, polite smile. It was a sad smile, really. The kind you give to someone who is bragging about a victory while standing on a trapdoor. I'm just doing my part for the family, Oswald, I replied, my voice steady. He patted me again, a condescending rhythm that felt like a countdown. Attaboy. Loyalty is everything, right? He walked away, convinced he was the master of this house. I watched him go, reflecting on the heavy burden of family duty. My mother always said blood is thicker than water, a sentiment that usually justifies 1,000 small cruelties. I've come to realize that while blood is thicker, it's also much harder to clean up when it's spilled by betrayal. I turned back to the coffee machine, realizing that those who underestimate others are usually blind to their own falling. Before leaving the lounge, I pulled my phone out and executed a subtle command. I planted a decoy file on the shared executive network, a false, highly confidential maritime route labeled Poseidon Strategic Alpha. It was a digital canary in a coal mine. I wanted to see how long it would take for the greed I knew was festering to trigger the first download. It took exactly 6 minutes. The IP address originated from within the building, but the destination was an external server owned by Gideon Harry. The speed of the betrayal was almost impressive. I retreated to my private, fortified server room, the heavy steel door sealing with a pressurized hiss. This was my sanctuary, a place where the messy emotions of the world were distilled into the binary clarity of data. I activated the 3 monitors, and the Friday shadows began to dance across the glass. For 3 months, I had been quietly compiling a dossier of Lizzie's movements. For 12 consecutive Fridays, the GPS logs showed she never stepped foot on the school grounds. Instead, the high-definition surveillance I'd commissioned showed her entering a boutique hotel downtown, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. But the affair was only the surface. The insane part of the data was the digital footprint she left behind. I pulled up the internal logs of my own encrypted hardware. On each of those Fridays, Lizzie had been using my administrative credentials to access the Project Poseidon blueprints. She wasn't just meeting Gideon for a tryst. She was acting as a mule for Oswald's corporate espionage. She was trading my life's work for the hollow attention Gideon Harry offered her. Looking back now, I should have seen that she wasn't just breaking my heart. She was selling the pieces to the highest bidder. I didn't realize it then, but that moment of absolute proof changed the way I viewed everyone. A profound sense of liberation washed over me, a cold thrill that had nothing to do with joy, the weight of trying to save a ghost, a version of a wife who no longer existed, had finally lifted. I felt the shark finally fully submerge. I wasn't a victim of a family conspiracy. I was the one who controlled the environment. Some people don't deserve your forgiveness, and they certainly don't deserve your silence. I began the digital counterstrike, my fingers moving across the keyboard with a surgical, rhythmic precision that felt like a heartbeat. I was ghosting my own server, creating a digital mirror that looked identical to our core assets, but was in reality a meticulously constructed trap. Every file Lizzie or Oswald stole from this point on would be tagged with a hidden tracking beacon. I prepared a formal cease and desist and a complaint for trade secret misappropriation under the Defend Trade Secrets Act. Every digital log was timestamped and notarized via a secure e-discovery service, making the evidence inadmissible to deny in a federal court. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply restoring the balance that they had chosen to disrupt. I thought about the value of a man's character as I watched the green lines of code scroll by. I told myself that I refused to feel hate, for hate is a chain that binds you to the one you despise. I was simply doing the math. I am the youngest, but I am the only one who knows the true cost of this company, I whispered to the empty room. I closed the laptop just as a sharp knock sounded on the heavy door. I checked the camera feed. Oswald. I opened the door and he stood there with a glossy invitation in his hand. Anniversary gala tomorrow night, Shark, he said, grinning. The whole city will be there. I want you front and center. It's a family celebration, after all. I looked at the invitation, then back at his hungry eyes. I smiled, a calm, steady expression that didn't reach my eyes. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Oswald. It's going to be an unforgettable evening for the Blackwoods. He nodded, oblivious to the fact that he was inviting the executioner to the feast. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew the stage was set. I walked out of the server room, the cool air of the office feeling like a new beginning. I realized that the Project Poseidon codes Lizzie had stole today contained a logic bomb I had planted months ago as a failsafe. The moment they tried to sell that data to Gideon or integrate it into his systems, it would detonate, corrupting every server it touched. They were planning my downfall, but I had already mapped out their extinction. That's where it all started, the day I stopped being the brother they ignored and became the consequence they couldn't survive. The Blackwood estate in Lake Forest glittered under the moonlight like a crown made of ice. Inside the grand ballroom, the warm golden glow of the chandeliers masked the cold intentions of everyone wearing the family name. I stood near the marble bar, clutching a glass of water, watching the elite of Chicago sip vintage scotch and trade favors. My own family swirled around me like a school of piranhas, careful never to let their eyes meet mine. Have you ever felt completely erased in a room full of people who share your blood? It's a hollow, ringing silence that no amount of orchestral music can drown out. Oswald took the center stage, his chest puffed out like a conqueror. He tapped his microphone, the sharp feedback cutting through the chatter. Friends, family, colleagues, he began, his voice projecting a false warmth that made my skin crawl. Tonight is about the Blackwood legacy, but it is also a difficult night. My younger brother, Shark, will be taking an indefinite medical leave starting tonight. He paused, letting a performative sigh escape. The pressure of our recent merger has led to a nervous breakdown. He's simply not built for the heavy lifting this empire requires. I watched him from the shadows of the bar, my expression a mask of stoic calm that seemed to unnerve my mother as she stood near the stage. I remembered my father's quiet wisdom. Dignity isn't something others give you. It's the only thing they can't take unless you hand it to them. Looking back now, I realize that those who use humiliation as a weapon are only revealing their own deep-seated fear of being seen for who they truly are. I didn't feel the urge to scream. I felt the absolute, freezing clarity of a man who finally knew exactly where he stood. I slipped out onto the balcony, the freezing Chicago air a welcome relief from the suffocating scent of lilies and greed. Lizzie was there, draped in diamonds I knew Gideon Harry had paid for. She looked at me with a shallow, practiced pity. "Shark, just sign the papers and go quietly," she whispered, her eyes darting back toward the ballroom. "It's for the sake of the family. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I looked at her with a profound, quiet kindness, seeing the wreckage of the woman I used to love. "I hope the price you got for our life was worth the cost of your soul, Lizzie," I said softly. She flinched as if I'd struck her. Before she could respond, Oswald appeared in the doorway, his eyes hard. He didn't invite me back in. He pulled me into the dark, oak-paneled library. My mother was already there, standing by the door like a silent sentinel. Oswald slid 2 documents across the heavy desk. The first was a voluntary surrender of fiduciary duties. The second was far more sinister. It was a pre-written admission of sole oversight for a $100 million tax fraud scheme Oswald had been cooking for years. "Sign this and leave Chicago tonight," Oswald growled. "Or Lizzie and I will testify that you are an unfit father. We'll take Maya away, and you'll never see her again." The toxic coronation was complete. My own mother didn't move, didn't speak. Her silence was the final confirmation of their moral bankruptcy. I picked up the golden fountain pen, the very one I had used to save the company's first major deal years ago. A wave of sorrow washed over me, not for myself, but for the hollow people standing before me. Sometimes the people you'd take a bullet for are the ones behind the trigger. I signed the bottom of the blank-looking page, my eyes fixed on Oswald with a terrifying stillness. He thought he was crowning himself king. He didn't realize he was just signing the manifest of a sinking ship. I walked out of that library and back into the gala, my footsteps light on the heavy carpets. I found Maya sleeping in a quiet corner of the estate, under the watchful eye of the nanny. I knelt beside her and kissed her forehead, my face softening into the only true emotion I had felt all night. She stirred slightly, her small hand brushing against my cheek. "Daddy?" she murmured. "I'm here, sweetheart," I whispered. "I've got you." In that moment, I wasn't a scapegoat or a failed brother. I was a father. And a father does whatever is necessary to protect his child. Under Illinois law, a signature obtained under such extreme duress and through fraudulent inducement is voidable. Oswald was arrogant, but I was a risk analyst. I knew the ink in the pen I had brought, the one I used to sign his document, was a tactical fading ink. In 4 hours, that admission of guilt would be nothing but a blank sheet of paper. I looked at the grand estate, the boards and beams of my childhood. A house is built with wood and stone, but a home is built with love and dreams. This place had become a tomb of expensive wood and cold stone. I prepared to leave, knowing I had exactly 12 hours before the emergency board meeting. Every move was now a part of a larger, lethal geometry. I walked to the valet, the cold wind whipping my coat around my legs. Oswald followed me out, his scotch glass still in hand, gloating over the victory he thought he'd won. "Safe travels, little brother," he sneered. I turned and looked at him, a calm, steady smile on my lips. "You've spent your life trying to be the king of Blackwood, Oswald. I hope you've learned how to swim, because the tide is coming in faster than you think." The taillights of my car vanished into the Chicago mist, leaving the Blackwood estate in a festive glow that was about to be extinguished. As I reached the highway, I pulled out my burner phone. The time for silence was over. I made one call, my voice low and steady. "Gideon, it's Shark. I think it's time we discussed how Oswald plans to betray you tomorrow morning. I have the files you thought Lizzie was bringing you." I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew the hunter had finally become the prey's worst nightmare. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, with a soft, clinical chime. I adjusted my cuffs, feeling the weight of the digital recorder in my pocket, a silent witness to the carnage I was about to unleash. Walking toward the boardroom, I didn't feel like the discarded youngest son anymore. I felt like a precision instrument. I entered the room with a posture of absolute calm, my tailored suit serving as my armor against the cold, blue lighting of the Blackwood Maritime Tower. Oswald sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by Lizzie, who looked at me with a mixture of pity and triumph. They thought this was my funeral. They didn't realize it was my inauguration. Oswald didn't waste time. He slid the document I had signed at the gala across the table with a theatrical flourish. "It's over, Shark," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, silent room. "The board has reviewed your admission of sole oversight regarding the $100 million tax discrepancies. Your resignation is effective immediately." I remained silent, my eyes fixed on the digital clock on the wall. It was 8:59 a.m. I watched the seconds count down, reflecting on the profound kindness I still felt for the company my father had built with his bare hands. Legacy isn't about what you take from the world, Oswald. It's what you leave behind for those who actually deserve it. As the clock hit 9 a.m., the market opened, and every screen in the boardroom suddenly turned a deep, visceral blood red. Oswald's smug expression faltered. A piercing alarm began to blare from the server room behind the wall. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. "You forgot one thing, brother," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "The entire Blackwood security infrastructure is tied to my biometric heartbeat. It's a digital kill switch I installed the day you tried to bypass me last year. If they proceeded with this fraudulent ouster, the company's entire database would vanish into an unrecoverable void within minutes." The room descended into a high-stakes thriller panic. Board members were shouting, and I watched the sweat bead on Oswald's brow as he realized he was holding a crown that was currently melting in his hands. Lizzie's hands began to shake, her eyes darting toward the exit. It was a Dean-row, insane realization for them. There truly is no honor among traitors. Just then, the heavy double doors swung open, and Gideon Harry walked in. But he wasn't smiling. He walked straight to the table and dropped a heavy physical file in front of the board. I had spent the early morning hours explaining to Gideon how Oswald planned to use the stolen Project Poseidon codes to frame him for international sanctions violations. Gideon turned on Oswald with a ferocity that silenced the room, offering a full confession of their secret meetings in exchange for federal immunity. Lizzie's face went pale. She realized she was just a disposable tool for both men. Gideon looked right through her, as if she were made of glass. When you build a house of cards on the foundation of lies, don't be surprised when the first wind of truth brings it all down. I watched my own blood shred each other, feeling a heavy sorrow for the path they chose. I stood up and walked to the main monitor, tapping a command on my tablet. The screen shifted to a live feed of the Blackwood family accounts. Now, for the final act, I said quietly. I revealed the golden pen trick. The signature on Oswald's document had already vanished, the tactical ink leaving nothing but a blank space. But beneath it, I had layered a legal admission of Oswald's own embezzlement, which was now being broadcast to our primary creditors in real time. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply restoring the balance they had disrupted. Through a prearranged court order based on the evidence of Lizzie's corporate espionage and Oswald's fraud, I executed a total financial ghosting. All family assets had been legally transferred into a blind trust for Maya's future, managed by independent trustees. Oswald and Lizzie were left with zero access to the wealth they had tried to steal from me. They say you can't take it with you, Oswald, I said, looking at his shattered face. It turns out you can't even keep it while you're here if you don't have the integrity to hold it. I turned my back on his screaming and her sobbing, walking toward the exit. I paused at the door, looking back at the board members who had stood by in silence while I was being erased. The company is safe, but it's no longer yours to ruin, I told them. My voice was steady, a clear signal that the era of being underestimated was over. I've already contacted the FBI. They're waiting in the lobby. Looking back now, I realized that silence isn't a lack of power. It's the ultimate preparation for it. I didn't realize it then, but that moment of walking out was the first time I had ever truly been home. I stepped into the hallway, the air feeling lighter than it had in years. My lawyer was waiting by the elevators, holding a finalized divorce decree and an emergency custody order. For the first time, the shark wasn't hunting. He was protecting. But then, my phone buzzed with one last, desperate location alert. It was Lizzie's car, and she was heading toward the estate where Maya was being kept. The boardroom doors swung shut with a heavy, final thud behind me, leaving the ghosts of the Blackwood Empire to face the law. I stepped into the morning sun outside the tower, finally breathing air that didn't taste like betrayal. I had mapped out their extinction, and the plan was working with terrifying efficiency. I didn't know what was waiting for me at the estate, but I knew I was no longer the brother they ignored. I was the consequence they couldn't survive. That's where it all ended. The day the youngest son realized that the only way to save a family is sometimes to let the toxic parts of it burn away. The morning light over Lake Forest was a pale, shimmering white, reflecting off a fresh blanket of Chicago snow. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the engine humming a low, steady song of freedom. On the tablet mounted to my dashboard, a grainy news feed showed the final collapse of the Blackwood dynasty. Oswald was being escorted by federal agents into a waiting SUV, his expensive coat draped over his handcuffed wrists. I watched the footage with a stoic realization of justice. My face didn't betray a single flicker of joy or bitterness. It was simply the end of a long, wintry era. A somber stillness settled over me as I realized the family legacy was now a book that had been closed and shelved. I drove toward the gates of the seized estate, meeting my mother, the matriarch, one last time. She stood by the iron pillars, looking frail against the vast, empty house that had once been her fortress. She reached out a hand, asking for my help, her voice a fragile whisper in the cold. I looked at her, but the shark they had feared wasn't there, only a son who finally knew the value of peace. I explained to her that the family's remaining assets had been legally moved into a blind trust under the RICO Act. It was managed by independent trustees to ensure her care and Maya's future. The era of reckless power was over. Mercy is not the absence of justice, but the wisdom to ensure that pain does not repeat itself. I wasn't punishing her. I was protecting the only part of the family that remained untainted. I handed her the finalized legal documents, which included a strict non-disparagement clause and supervised visitation for Lizzie. The federal seizure of the Maritime Tower was complete. The law had done what I could not. It had cleared away the wreckage. As I shifted the car into gear, I realized that I had finally fulfilled my duty to the Blackwood name by ensuring it could no longer be used as a weapon. Looking back now, I see that closure doesn't come from an apology. It comes from the quiet strength of your own boundaries. As I pulled toward the exit, a figure appeared in the falling snow. Lizzie. She was waiting by the gate, looking small and fragile without her designer armor. She blocked my path, her hands shaking just as they had when she dropped the keys on the marble floor. I lowered the window slightly, the biting Chicago air cutting through the warmth of the cabin. She began to speak, spinning one last, desperate, Hail Mary lie about being a double agent who was only trying to protect me. I looked at her with a profound, weary kindness that I knew hurt her far more than any anger ever could. Lizzie, I've spent 8 years trying to be the man you deserved, I said, my voice as steady as the winter horizon. I'm going to spend the rest of my life being the man I deserve. This was the quiet departure. I didn't bring up Gideon or the 7 choices she had made to betray me. I simply handed her a small, white envelope. It didn't contain a check or a key. It was the contact information for a professional rehabilitation counselor. Even after everything, I chose to leave her with a path toward her own healing, because my humanity was never hers to take. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. I drove away from the wreckage of my past, heading toward the small school where Maya was waiting. The towers of Chicago were a fading silhouette in my rearview mirror. When I pulled up, Maya ran toward the car, her beaming face the only sun I needed. I lifted her up, her small weight a reminder of why I had fought so hard. Her safety watch was still on her wrist, but it was no longer a surveillance tool. It was just a toy she used to tell the time. We were finally safe. Strength is not found in how much you can destroy, but in how much you can rebuild after the storm. As we merged into the Chicago traffic, heading toward O'Hare for a flight to a place where nobody knew the name Blackwood, I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't known since I was a child. I watched Maya in the rearview mirror as she played with a stuffed animal, her laughter filling the car. The greatest deal I ever closed wasn't the $500 million merger. It was the one that bought my freedom and my daughter's future. I realized that while I was the youngest, I was the only one who truly understood the weight of our family's history, and I was the only one strong enough to put it down. The deep is no longer a place of fear for me. It's where I finally found my breath. I took a deep, steady breath of the filtered car air, realizing that the man I used to be, the one who begged for love and ignored the red flags, was gone. In his place was someone who knew his worth and refused to settle for less. The car moved forward into the white expanse of the highway, a clean slate stretching out before us. That's where it all ended, and where a real life finally began. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I was the one steering the ship now. Sometimes, walking away is the loudest victory you will ever win. It's the moment you stop letting others define your value and start believing in the person you see in the mirror. I looked at the snow-covered city one last time before we reached the terminal. I wasn't leaving out of weakness or spite. I was leaving because I had nothing left to prove to people who were never going to see me. I had won the war by refusing to stay on the battlefield. The sun broke through the clouds, lighting up the road like a path of gold. In the end, I realized that loyalty is a luxury you cannot afford to waste on those who don't value your soul. True peace doesn't come from their apology. It comes from your own decision to stop waiting for one. I chose to walk away, not because I was weak, but because I finally knew what I was worth. I believe everyone reaches a crossroads where they must decide if they are the victim of their past or the architect of their future. I chose to pick up the pen and write a new chapter. If you've ever had to choose yourself over a betrayal, you are not alone. I am reading every comment today. Tell me, what was the moment you finally decided to take back your life?